neighborhoods that need
The criminal justice system. Will Dalagiannis.
Ian Bruns.
Amber Hall.
Jesus Rodriguez.
Kenya Gray.
Sarah Steinway.
What is the criminal justice system? The criminal justice system is made up of several parts that work together to provide reform and safety for the people and to give criminals what they deserve. First part of the criminal justice system is law enforcement, which can be divided into local, state, and federal agencies. Local agencies consist of police departments, state agencies consist of highway patrol, and federal law enforcement consists of the FBI and Secret Service. The next part of the criminal justice system is courts and is where the process of prosecuting criminals is held. This process allows for the criminal case to be presented in front of a judge and jury. A decision will then be made whether one is found guilty or not and what legal punishment will follow. The last step in our criminal justice system is prison or other forms of rehabilitation. After a person is convicted of a crime, he or she is sent to a rehabilitation after often meaning prison. A prison is a place where criminals are legally held as a punishment for a crime. Other rehabilitation punishments include community service, probation, and drug/alcohol treatment. So this system was put in place to protect citizens and to give a fair punishment to those who commit a crime. However, this is not always the case. The inequity we chose for this topic is police brutality. Police brutality is the excessive use of unwarranted force by a U.S. law official on a citizen. This includes beating, racial abuse, unlawful killings, and indiscriminate use of riot control against protests.
Yeah, and so to kind of sort of go off of that, basically in the United States, it isn't regulated to just one particular area. I included a graph here that shows that police brutality is pretty much everywhere. On the graph, if you look closer, it shows the amount of tax dollars that each taxpayer pays annually into the police department. So if you can see, California and New York spend the most, and kind of unironically, they also have the highest rate of police brutality cases in America. Alaska is high as well, but they don't have as big a population, so their percentage is kind of sort of spiked up, but their population is smaller. So basically what this pretty much tells is a bigger story. So the more money that we pour into the police department kind of sort of correlates to how many police brutality cases we see in that state or in that area. Primarily like on the West Coast, there have been a lot of beatings. Rodney King is just one viable example that I can use. In New York, they had stop and frisk where people were being stopped and harassed simply for looking like a criminal. And obviously this isn't okay. So what we've come up with as a temporary or permanent solution is to either defund the police slowly or kind of sort of disband them over time, and come up with the new community policing type of option. So the only city to actually attempt this is Minneapolis currently. So, yeah.
So to add on to that, to the left there's a diagram that I included where it demonstrates the higher chances of police brutality occurring between two different states. And it's just pretty astonishing to see how it's more like you're 6 times more likely to be killed by a police officer in Oklahoma than you are in Georgia. And it's really a form of the culture that is expected or like seen there a lot because of the high tensions between citizens and police officers, especially since this is more in the southern states. Apart from that, there are 8 major cities across the US where police officers kill Black men at a higher rate than the US murder rate. And for reference, the US murder rate is considered to be quite high on its own. So the fact that it happens is unacceptable because of how we just allow these officers to do this. And sadly, most of the time, they just kind of get away with it.
Who? People of almost all backgrounds have been victims of police brutality at one point or another. There are certain trigger events that can cause police to be harsher on different races. However, some races are victims solely by stereotypes. For example, Muslims after 9/11, poor working class whites in the early 1900s, African Americans, and Hispanics. The group that has been targeted most by police recently is African Americans. In communities that haven't had a great financial and cultural history, police are usually more willing to make rash and violent decisions when the occasion does not call for it. According to Statista, the group of people killed most by police overall is actually white people. But however, this does not shy away from the fact that police brutality affects us all and needs to undergo reform. Redlining occurs when neighborhoods bring in such a low income that it's a risk for banks to loan them money. African Americans living in urban areas are more likely to be victims of police violence, and housing is a big factor at play. Due to redlining in the 1930s, many poor Black families were forced out of nice neighborhoods and had to live in neglected parts of the cities. These neighborhoods didn't get the attention they needed and became a dangerous environment. This dangerous environment brought in police forces who were more on edge and violent towards the residents. The rise of police violence has increased and is commonly associated with African Americans and other marginalized groups. To the right here is a map of Columbus, Ohio, and it shows how the Columbus banks redlined the city. The red areas are high risk for loans, yellow is moderate risk, blue is little risk, and the green areas have no risk to loan. If you pull it all together, the cycle starts with numerous low-income families, and when they ask for assistance from banks, the banks say no because their incomes are too low, and so then the neighborhoods that need financial assistance go into neglect and disarray as many of these city services neglect them, and then police targeting happens. Police associates bad neighborhoods to abundant crime, and that's when police brutality kicks in. When neighborhoods are neglected, crime skyrockets and creates a violent atmosphere. Police are called into what they perceive as a war zone and shoot first and then ask questions later.
Going off of that, the connection to the physical space first begins in differentiating medium-sized versus small-sized police departments by area. So obviously larger metropolitan statistical areas are going to have more restrictive deadly force policies. But based on national trend shootings written by the ACLU in their community action manual, smaller cities have not caught up to implementing restrictive deadly force policies. And that leads to addressing physical deterioration. So smaller cities are also going to have issues with funding for implementing physical improvements that decrease crime as well as police brutality. And that goes along with implementing defensible space areas, which also goes along with the culture of areas. So once we see these vacant lots and things happening in our inner cities and urban areas, it's those weak mayor councils where the mayor ultimately has no say, and it's a city where it's a board of trustees, such as like a smaller city. They're going to have less defensible space, and the residents are going to not be able to control, their area. So that also goes. They did a study with urban gardening, and when you do complete housing blocks, people ultimately feel safer because residents have the ability to control that semi-public space. So that includes just extending the sidewalk a little more, just so that residents know that that is their property. And then lastly, going into policing and spatial profiling, NYU Furman Center recommended enforcing spatial boundaries in larger metros. And then also this addresses resident-based territorial strategies.
So our connection to class. In class, we discussed different racial inequities in the housing market. There are multiple ways that cities enforce these racial inequities, and 3 of which include racial zoning, which was put in place to prevent the spread of disease because white people at the time thought Black people carried diseases. Covenants, which is a contract between the buyer and the seller, and the covenant allows for the buyer or the seller to say, hey, I don't want this person to move in, or I do want it to only be specifically for these people. Also in discriminating against minorities. And expulsive zoning, which is when undesirable land uses and housing types are no longer allowed in the wealthy neighborhoods. And these wealthy neighborhoods typically consisted of white people. Another tactic that was used was redlining, and redlining separates neighborhoods by race and religion. The ultimate goal was to benefit white people and segregate the minorities. We researched that African Americans account for about 12.5% of the overall US population, but accounted for more than 22% of those killed by police. And a person is 6 times more likely to be killed by police in Oklahoma than Georgia, which is adding off what Jesus said in the diagram above. And you can see how high the rates of police killings are in Oklahoma compared to Georgia, along with the cities even within Oklahoma compared to other cities around the country. And how does it connect? Police brutality displays itself through racial inequity and location, which is exactly what we were learning in class about the redlining and the different ways to separate minorities from whites.
All right. Thank you.
The end.